Dr. Andrew Hayes believed he was merely doing the right thing when he saved a vulnerable black infant abandoned in Central Park. Little did he anticipate that this single gesture of kindness would irrevocably transform his life. Years later, a startling secret about the child he raised surfaces, dismantling everything he once understood. What is this heartbreaking truth? And how could one act of rescue lead to such profound sorrow? Also, please share where you're watching from, and if you appreciate this story, consider subscribing for more narratives like this. Let's dive in. Dr. Andrew Hayes meandered aimlessly along the well-trodden paths of Central Park, his hands deeply tucked into his coat pockets. It was late afternoon, and the park was illuminated by a golden hue, the kind that made everything sparkle, except for Andrew. Despite the surrounding beauty, he felt disconnected, as if the world's vibrancy was just out of his grasp. Since his wife's passing 2 years earlier, life had devolved into a monotonous cycle of work and restless nights. The park, once a sanctuary where they shared serene moments, now only highlighted her absence. He took a deep breath, the crisp October air cutting sharply into his lungs, and exhaled slowly, watching his breath fade into the cool sky. A gentle wind stirred the colorful autumn leaves, creating a whirlwind of reds, oranges, and yellows along the path. As he walked, his thoughts wandered to familiar feelings of regret and endless what-ifs. What if he had taken more time off to be with her in her final months? What if he hadn't submerged himself in work to escape the inevitable? Just as he was about to head back towards the exit, a faint, nearly imperceptible sound pierced his thoughts. A cry. Andrew halted abruptly, straining to hear over the soft rustling of the leaves. Had he imagined it? He glanced around, but the park was largely empty, with only a few distant joggers and a couple walking their dog. The sound came again, slightly louder this time, a cry, gentle yet unmistakably that of a baby. His heart began to race, a blend of confusion and urgency flooding him. He veered off the main path, the soles of his shoes crunching on the gravel as he followed the direction of the sound. It led him deeper into the park, towards a secluded bench shaded by a large oak tree, its branches laden with the vibrant hues of autumn leaves. His eyes searched the area, looking for the source of the cry, but all he saw was the open expanse of grass and trees swaying in the breeze. Then, beneath the bench, barely visible except for a bundle of worn fabric, he noticed it. Andrew's breath caught in his throat. Kneeling slowly, he reached out with shaky hands, gently pulling back the edges of the faded blue blanket. His heart thudded in his chest as he revealed the tiny form of a baby boy. The child's skin was a rich brown, starkly contrasting against the faded fabric of the blanket. His eyes were tightly shut and his tiny fists waved helplessly in the air as he emitted another cry, a sound so small yet filled with desperate need. The world around Andrew seemed to contract to this single moment. The noises of the park, the rustling leaves, distant footsteps and city hum dissolved into the background. All that existed was the helpless infant before him. Instinctively, Andrew reached out and lifted the baby into his arms, cradling him against his chest with a tenderness he hadn't realized he still possessed. The baby's cries quieted almost immediately, his small body relaxing slightly in Andrew's warmth. For several moments, Andrew stood there in stunned silence, holding the baby close, his mind racing. Who could have left him here? Why? He looked around frantically, searching for any sign of the child's parents. But the park remained empty, aside from the distant joggers and the soft rustling of leaves. The weight of the baby in his arms felt both surreal and grounding simultaneously. A mix of protectiveness and overwhelming tenderness surged through him, an emotion he hadn't felt since his wife had passed. It was a feeling that almost took his breath away, one he thought had died with her. Yet here it was, raw and powerful, filling the void in his heart. He glanced down at the child, who blinked up at him with wide, curious eyes, his tiny fingers clutching weakly at the collar of Andrew's coat. There was something deeply innocent, yet also painfully vulnerable about the boy. Left alone in the park with nothing but a worn blanket to shield him from the world, "What are you doing out here all alone?" Andrew whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of the moment. "Who would leave you like this?" He took another quick look around, but it was as if the world had forgotten about them, him and the child, alone together in this hidden corner of the park. Andrew's mind raced with possibilities. He couldn't just leave the baby here, but what was he supposed to do? Call the police? Social services? The thought of the child disappearing into the cold machinery of the foster care system made his stomach churn. He had witnessed too many cases like that in his years as a doctor. Children passed from one home to another, never knowing the love and stability they deserved. A wave of determination surged through him. No, he wouldn't let that happen to this boy. Not if he could help it. Without hesitation, Andrew pulled his coat tighter around the baby and began walking toward the park's exit, his mind already formulating plans. He would take the boy to Lenox Hill Hospital, ensure he was okay, and then, well, he would figure something out. One thing was clear, he wasn't about to let this child slip through the cracks. As he strode toward the city streets, the baby securely nestled in his arms, Andrew felt something shift inside him. A glimmer of purpose returning to his life. It wasn't just the baby's life that had been saved that day. Somehow, in that fleeting moment of connection, Andrew had rediscovered a piece of himself that he thought was lost forever. He looked down at the boy, now peacefully asleep against his chest, and whispered softly, "Don't worry, little one. I've got you now. We're going to figure this out together." Hours later, Andrew found himself seated in the sterile, brightly lit waiting room of Lenox Hill Hospital. His foot tapped nervously against the linoleum floor, the soft beeping of machines and the muffled voices of medical staff filling the air around him. Across the room, the nurses had whisked the baby, his baby, if he dared to think of him that way, behind the swinging doors, leaving Andrew in a state of anxious uncertainty. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and buried his face in his hands. The weight of what had transpired was only just beginning to settle in. The baby had been abandoned, left alone in the cold, with no one but Andrew to find him. A surge of anger welled up in his chest at the thought of someone so heartless as to leave a helpless child alone in the park. Who could do something like that? And why? He shook his head, trying to make sense of it all, but there were no answers. Only questions. Andrew glanced toward the swinging doors every few seconds, waiting, hoping for some news. His mind raced with possibilities. Who was the child? Where had he come from? But more than those questions, something far more personal tugged at the back of his mind. He had always envisioned being a father one day. He and his late wife Emily had talked about it endlessly during the early years of their marriage. They had planned for it, dreamed about it, a house filled with laughter, bedtime stories, and the simple joy of watching a child grow. But fate had charted a different course. Emily had fallen ill, and the dreams of children had been quietly set aside as they dealt with hospital visits, treatments, and the grim reality of her prognosis. After her death, Andrew had abandoned the idea of fatherhood altogether, convinced it wasn't in the cards for him. The thought of raising a child on his own had seemed impossible, and the ensuing loneliness left him with little room for hope. Yet here he was, sitting in a hospital waiting room with the scent of baby powder still clinging to his jacket. A child had been placed into his arms by chance, or perhaps something more. Fate? Destiny? Andrew wasn't one to believe in such things, but the thought clung to him now, refusing to let go. Was this moment meant to happen? Was this his second chance? The doors swung open, and a nurse appeared, holding a clipboard in one hand and a reassuring smile on her face. "Dr. Hayes?" she called softly. Andrew stood immediately, his heart pounding as he approached her. "The baby is fine," she began, her voice kind but professional. "He's a little dehydrated, but otherwise, he's healthy. We've given him fluids, and he's resting comfortably now." Andrew let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, relief washing over him. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly, but then the nurse's next words struck him like a cold wave. "We've contacted social services. They'll be here shortly to take over." The word stung more than he expected. Social services. Of course, it was the logical next step. The system would step in, take the child, and he would be placed into foster care, possibly shuffled from one family to another. Andrew had seen it too many times, heard too many stories of children getting lost in the system, bounced between temporary homes, never finding stability. It wasn't right. This baby didn't deserve that. "Is there anything I can do?" Andrew's voice cracked as he spoke, surprising himself with the intensity of his own question. "Can I keep him?" The nurse blinked, clearly taken aback by his request. "You want TDO to keep the baby?" she repeated, her tone filled with cautious curiosity. Andrew hesitated, realizing the gravity of what he was asking. I found him," he continued, his words coming faster now. "I don't know who his parents are or why he was abandoned, but I can't just let him disappear into the system. I want to help him." The nurse's eyes softened as she looked at him, recognizing the sincerity in his plea. She set down her clipboard, her professional demeanor giving way to something more personal. "Dr. Hayes, becoming a foster parent is a significant responsibility. It's not a decision to be made lightly." "I know," Andrew replied, his voice steadying, "but I've spent years taking care of people, saving lives. I know this is different, but I also know I can provide this boy with a home. He deserves a chance at a better life." The nurse regarded him for a moment, weighing her response. "If you're serious, I can connect you with the right people to start the process," she finally said, her tone cautious but encouraging. "It's not a quick or easy journey, but if you're committed, it's possible." Andrew nodded, a sense of resolve settling over him. This wasn't just about filling a void in his own life. It was about giving this child, this abandoned boy, a real chance. Maybe this was what he had been waiting for all along. Maybe this was his purpose. The following weeks were a whirlwind of paperwork, phone calls, and interviews. Social workers visited his home, asking questions about his life, his job, and his ability to provide for a child. They inspected every corner of his apartment, ensuring it was safe, inquiring if he had plans for childcare, a support network. Andrew answered each question thoughtfully, knowing that everything he said mattered. The process was grueling and intrusive at times, but Andrew never wavered. He had made up his mind. He wasn't going to let Elijah, yes, Elijah, he had already started calling the baby by the name that felt right, slip away. His medical career helped in some ways, giving him credibility as someone who understood the gravity of taking care of another human being. But being a doctor didn't equate to being a parent. He had to prove that he could provide the love, stability, and emotional foundation that Elijah would need. Each time a social worker visited, Andrew felt the weight of their judgment. He knew they were watching, evaluating, waiting to see if he would falter, but he didn't. Instead, he found himself becoming more and more certain with each passing day that this was the right decision. Finally, after weeks of waiting, the call came. Andrew was at work when the phone rang, and his heart raced as he answered. The voice on the other end, a social worker he had grown familiar with, delivered the news he had been hoping for. "Dr. Hayes, I'm happy to tell you that you've been approved as Elijah's foster parent." Andrew barely heard the rest of the conversation. Relief, joy, and disbelief surged through him all at once. "It's real," he thought, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the phone. "Elijah is coming home." That evening, Andrew stood in the small nursery he had prepared in his apartment. A crib by the window, soft blankets folded neatly, a few books and toys stacked on the shelf. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start. The doorbell rang, and when Andrew opened it, a social worker stood there holding Elijah, bundled up in a warm blanket. Andrew's heart swelled as he reached out to take him, the small weight of the baby settling into his arms like a perfect fit. "Welcome home, Elijah," Andrew whispered softly, his voice thick with emotion. He looked down at the baby's peaceful face, and for the first time in a long time, Andrew felt a sense of peace, too. This was the beginning of something new, something extraordinary. The early days with Elijah were a whirlwind. Andrew had never imagined how drastically his life would change, even with all the preparation he had done. His medical training had taught him how to remain calm under pressure, how to manage emergencies, and how to handle sleepless nights. But nothing could have prepared him for the emotional weight that came with caring for this tiny, helpless boy. Andrew had been accustomed to late nights in the hospital, often staying on call for emergencies, but there was something profoundly different about the stillness of his apartment at 2 a.m., with Elijah's tiny cries echoing through the quiet. The world outside seemed far away, just the two of them, alone in the dim light of the nursery. Elijah's cries would start out as small whimpers, growing louder and more desperate until Andrew scooped him up, cradling him in his arms, whispering soft reassurances that neither of them fully understood. The first few nights had been an adjustment, to say the least. Andrew found himself fumbling with bottles in the kitchen, pacing back and forth across the living room to soothe the baby, his medical expertise offering little comfort in the face of Elijah's constant needs. The exhaustion was real, but so was the joy that came with it. Each time Elijah quieted, settling against his chest with his tiny hand gripping Andrew's shirt, Andrew felt a surge of love that was both unfamiliar and overwhelming. In those quiet moments, Andrew realized something that took him by surprise. Elijah was filling the empty space left by Emily's death. The loneliness that had once gripped him, that hollow ache he had carried for so long, began to soften. He still missed his wife, he always would. But caring for Elijah gave him a new purpose. He no longer came home to silence. He no longer went through his days in a daze of grief. Instead, his thoughts were filled with the well-being of the little boy now at the center of his world. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the bond between them grew deeper. The blur of sleepless nights gave way to a routine, diaper changes, bottle feedings, and quiet moments of watching Elijah sleep, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. Andrew found himself looking forward to their time together, even the challenging parts. Elijah's coos and giggles were like music, filling the once empty apartment with sounds of life. And then, one evening, it happened. Andrew was sitting on the floor of the living room, surrounded by a mess of soft blocks and stuffed animals. Elijah, now crawling with determination, was babbling to himself, his chubby hands reaching for a toy lion. Andrew watched, his heart swelling with pride at how far the little boy had come in such a short time. But what came next took Andrew completely by surprise. "Dada," Elijah said, his voice soft but clear. Andrew froze, his breath catching in his throat. Did he just say? Elijah looked up at him, a wide grin spreading across his face as if he knew exactly what he had just done. "Dada," he repeated, louder this time, his little arms reaching out towards Andrew. Tears welled up in Andrew's eyes before he could stop them. He had been called doctor for years, a title that had always carried a sense of pride and accomplishment. But hearing "Dada" come from Elijah's lips was something else entirely. It was a title he hadn't expected, one he hadn't realized he needed so desperately. Andrew scooped Elijah into his arms, holding him close as tears spilled down his cheeks. "Yes, buddy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your Dada." The months passed, and Elijah grew from a baby into a curious, adventurous toddler. Andrew watched in awe as Elijah hit each milestone, his little personality emerging with every new discovery. First, there were the wobbly steps, tentative at first, as Elijah gripped the edge of the coffee table for balance. Andrew stood a few feet away, his arms outstretched, encouraging him softly. "You can do it, Elijah. Come to Dada." With a look of pure determination, Elijah let go of the table and took his first unsteady steps toward Andrew. One step, then two, and then he stumbled, falling into Andrew's waiting arms. They both burst into laughter, the sound filling the apartment, and for the first time in years, Andrew felt a sense of completeness. As the years rolled on, fatherhood transformed Andrew in ways he hadn't anticipated. His apartment, once pristine and meticulously organized, was now littered with toys, picture books, and colorful artwork taped to the walls. And yet, it never felt more like home. The once silent rooms were filled with Elijah's laughter, his excited babbling, and the thump of little feet running across the floor. Weekends became their special time. Andrew made sure to clear his schedule, dedicating every Saturday to adventures with Elijah. The Bronx Zoo quickly became one of their favorite spots. Andrew would lift Elijah onto his shoulders, letting him get a better view of the towering giraffes and the playful monkeys. Elijah's eyes would widen in wonder, his small hands gripping Andrew's hair as he leaned forward to get a closer look. "Lions, Dada. Lions," Elijah would shout, pointing excitedly at the enclosure. Andrew would chuckle, his heart swelling with pride at the pure joy in his son's voice. They'd spend hours at the zoo, exploring each exhibit, and Elijah's fascination with the world around him never seemed to wane. Andrew would often catch himself staring at the boy in awe, wondering how he had gotten so lucky to have this little soul in his life. Basketball at the neighborhood court became another cherished tradition. Andrew, once an avid player in his college days, found himself teaching Elijah how to dribble the ball, though the boy was far more interested in chasing it around the court than learning any real technique. Elijah's infectious giggle echoed through the park as he tried to mimic Andrew's moves, the ball bouncing between his tiny hands. No matter how exhausted Andrew was from work, those moments together were enough to recharge him. Elijah had a way of making everything seem lighter, brighter. And then there were the quieter moments, the times when the hustle and bustle of the city faded into the background, and it was just the two of them at home. Andrew would tuck Elijah into bed each night, reading him stories from well-worn picture books, their voices mingling as they recited the words they both knew by heart. "Good night, stars. Good night, air," Elijah would say sleepily, his small voice drifting off as Andrew closed the book and kissed his forehead. In those moments, Andrew would linger by the door, watching as Elijah's eyes fluttered shut, his breathing slowing into the peaceful rhythm of sleep. The apartment, once a place of sorrow and loss, was now filled with warmth. It wasn't about what Andrew had lost anymore. It was about what he had gained. Elijah wasn't just a child he had taken in. Elijah was his son, in every way that mattered. For Elijah, Andrew was the only father he had ever known. And for Andrew, fatherhood had become the greatest gift, one he hadn't realized he needed, but one he would cherish for the rest of his life. By the time Elijah turned 13, the bond between him and Andrew had become as strong as any biological tie. Their lives had fallen into a familiar and comforting rhythm, full of the rituals and routines they had built together over the years. Every Saturday, they could be found at their favorite park, throwing frisbees or shooting hoops until the sun dipped low in the sky. Movie nights were sacred. Andrew would pop the popcorn, Elijah would pick the movie, and they'd sit on the couch for hours, laughing, groaning at the cheesy dialogue, or debating the merits of the latest superhero blockbuster. And no matter how old Elijah got, Andrew still read to him some nights, his voice soft as Elijah drifted off to sleep. These small moments had created an unshakable bond between them, one that Andrew thought would never be questioned. But as Elijah entered his teenage years, the simple joy of childhood gave way to a new kind of curiosity, one that left Andrew both proud and terrified. It started with small, almost innocuous comments, questions that seemed harmless at first, but carried a weight Andrew wasn't ready to confront. Elijah had always known he was different from Andrew. His skin was darker, his curls tighter, his features a clear contrast to Andrew's pale complexion and straight brown hair. But for years, those differences hadn't mattered. Elijah had never asked why, and Andrew had never felt the need to explain. But now, as Elijah entered adolescence, the world around him began to highlight those differences in ways that Andrew couldn't protect him from. It started with strangers, a waitress at a diner who commented, "You two don't look alike, but I can see the love," or a passerby who gave a curious glance when Elijah and Andrew walked side by side in the city. And then there were the kids at school, who weren't always as tactful. Elijah had never mentioned any of it, but Andrew could sense something shifting. The questions were bubbling to the surface, and it was only a matter of time before Elijah would ask the one question Andrew had been dreading for years. One evening, after a particularly quiet dinner, Elijah sat across from Andrew, absent-mindedly pushing the remnants of his spaghetti around his plate. Andrew glanced up, sensing the tension in the room. Elijah wasn't his usual chatty self, and Andrew could feel the weight of something unsaid hanging between them. "Elijah?" Andrew said gently, putting down his fork. "You okay, buddy?" Elijah hesitated, his gaze focused on his plate. Andrew could see the conflict in his eyes, the way his brow furrowed in deep thought. Finally, Elijah looked up, his voice soft but steady. "Dad," he began, the word carrying more weight than usual, "why don't I look like you?" Andrew felt his heart sink, the moment he had both anticipated and feared finally here. He had always known this question would come, but no amount of preparation made it any easier. His stomach tightened as he searched for the right words, trying to balance the truth with the love that had defined their relationship. Andrew took a deep breath, steadying himself before speaking. "Families come in all shapes and sizes, son," he said gently. "What matters most is the love we share, not how we look." Elijah nodded slowly, but Andrew could tell that wasn't enough. The curiosity, the confusion, none of it was going away. Andrew's answer, though honest, didn't satisfy the deeper question Elijah was really asking. Elijah wanted to know why. Why he didn't look like Andrew. Why he wasn't like other kids who resembled their parents. Why their family felt different. For a moment, silence hung between them, thick with unspoken questions and years of unanswered truths. Andrew could feel his heart pounding in his chest, knowing this was a conversation that would change things. How much should he tell Elijah? Was now the right time? Would Elijah be angry, hurt, or feel betrayed by the truth? These thoughts raced through Andrew's mind, but he pushed them aside, knowing that Elijah deserved honesty, no matter how difficult it was to say. "Elijah," Andrew began carefully, "there's something I've been wanting to talk to you about for a while now." Elijah's eyes widened slightly, curiosity sparking. "What is it, Dad?" His voice was cautious, like he sensed that something important was coming. Andrew swallowed the lump forming in his throat. "When you were a baby," he said slowly, "I found you, in Central Park. You were just a few months old, and you had been left there, abandoned." Elijah's face shifted from curiosity to confusion, then to something Andrew couldn't quite read. He was listening intently, hanging on every word. "I don't know who your biological parents are," Andrew continued, his voice gentle, "but I couldn't let you go into the foster system. I decided to take you in, to be your foster father. And after a while, you became my son, not by blood, but by love." Andrew watched as Elijah processed the information, his brows knitting together as the weight of the truth settled over him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Elijah's fork clattered against the plate as he let it fall, pushing his chair back slightly. "So, I'm not your real son?" Elijah's voice was small, unsure, and the hurt in his words made Andrew's chest tighten. "No," Andrew said quickly, shaking his head. "No, Elijah. You are my real son. You've always been my son. I just didn't give birth to you. But that doesn't change anything. I love you just the same, as if you were my own flesh and blood." Elijah looked down at his hands, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edges of the table. "But I don't know anything about where I come from, who my parents are, why they left me." Andrew's heart ached at the pain in Elijah's voice. He wished he could give him more answers, wished he could tell him something that would ease the confusion and the hurt. But the truth was, Andrew didn't know why Elijah had been abandoned, or who his biological parents were. All he knew was that he had found Elijah when the world had turned its back on him, and he had vowed to love him unconditionally ever since. "I'm sorry, Elijah," Andrew said softly, reaching across the table to place a hand on Elijah's. "I don't know why your parents left you. I wish I had those answers for you. But what I do know is that you are loved now, and that's what matters." You have a family here, with me. You always will." Elijah's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and Andrew could see the storm of emotions swirling beneath the surface. Anger, confusion, sadness, and somewhere deep down, a sense of belonging that he had never questioned before. After a long moment, Elijah wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and looked up at Andrew. "Do you think they ever wanted me? My real parents?" Andrew's heart broke a little at the question. He wished he could tell Elijah that his parents had loved him, that they had no choice but to leave him, but the truth was, he didn't know. What he did know, however, was that Elijah was loved more than he could ever imagine. "I don't know, son," Andrew said honestly. "But what I do know is that you are loved now, and that's what matters. You have a family here with me. You always will." Elijah nodded slowly, the tears slipping silently down his cheeks. Andrew stood up and moved around the table, pulling Elijah into a tight hug. Elijah didn't resist. Instead, he buried his face in Andrew's chest, letting the emotions of the moment wash over him. "I love you, Dad," Elijah whispered, his voice muffled. "I love you too, son," Andrew whispered back, his voice thick with emotion. They remained in that embrace for an extended period, the gravity of their conversation still present but softened by the unwavering bond they shared. Andrew understood that this was merely the start of many questions, anticipating that one day Elijah might seek out the truth about his origins. However, for the time being, he was satisfied holding his son close, confident that the love between them would help them navigate whatever challenges lay ahead. The evening was serene, the subtle hum of the city seeming distant, and the apartment bathed in a gentle, warm light from the lamps Andrew had switched on. Elijah was likely in his room, perhaps finishing his homework, while Andrew tidied up after dinner, enjoying the peaceful rhythm of the day. It was the kind of evening Andrew treasured, simple, unremarkable, yet soothing in its familiarity. Then, unexpectedly, there was a knock at the door. Andrew frowned, checking the time on the clock. It was late for visitors, and he wasn't anticipating anyone. He wiped his hands on a dish towel and approached the door, a strange unease settling in his chest. Upon opening it, his heart skipped a beat. Standing on his doorstep was a couple, both well-dressed but visibly nervous. The man, tall and broad-shouldered, had his hands deep in his coat pockets, his eyes reflecting emotions Andrew couldn't quite decipher. Anxiety? Regret? The woman beside him had her arms tightly crossed, as if protecting herself from something unseen, her eyes briefly meeting Andrew's before darting away. "Can I help you?" Andrew asked, his tone cautious yet courteous. The man cleared his throat, taking a step forward. "Dr. Hayes?" His voice wavered slightly, betraying the tension he was attempting to conceal. "I'm Matthew Cooper, and this is my wife, Sarah." Andrew felt his pulse quicken. Something about the situation felt off. "Yes, I'm Dr. Hayes," he replied slowly, his curiosity piqued. "What brings you here?" The couple exchanged a glance, seemingly deciding who would deliver the news. It was Sarah who finally spoke, her voice soft but laden with emotion. "We're Elijah's biological parents." For a moment, Andrew struggled to breathe. The words hung heavily in the air, making everything around him feel stagnant. He stared at the couple, his mind racing to comprehend their statement. Elijah's biological parents? They had been mere shadows in his son's life for 13 years. Names on official documents, a past Elijah had never considered would resurface. Yet here they stood, real and undeniable, on his doorstep. Andrew's world seemed to tilt as 1,000 thoughts flooded his mind. This couldn't be real. Elijah wasn't merely his foster son, he was his son, the boy he had nurtured, cared for, and loved as his own. Now the past he had always known was resurfacing, bringing with it turmoil. I don't understand," Andrew stammered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "You left him." Matthew's expression tightened, a shadow of guilt crossing his face. "We didn't have a choice," he replied quietly. "We were homeless. We had nothing, no food, no shelter, no means to care for him. Leaving him in the park was the hardest decision we've ever made, but we believed it was the only way to give him a chance. Sarah's eyes welled with tears as she continued. We thought, if someone found him, he'd have a better life than we could provide. We never stopped thinking about him, never stopped wondering where he was or if he was safe. Andrew's breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to process their words. Memories of that day in the park flashed before him, finding Elijah wrapped in that faded blue blanket, feeling an overwhelming sense of protectiveness that had never faded. He had dedicated years to filling the void in Elijah's life, ensuring he never felt unwanted or unloved. But now, facing the very people who had abandoned Elijah, they wanted to reconnect. Before Andrew could respond, he heard footsteps approaching from behind, unmistakable in their presence. Elijah appeared in the hallway, his eyes filled with confusion as he took in the scene. He glanced between Andrew and the couple standing at the doorway. "Dad, who are they?" Elijah asked, his voice a blend of curiosity and concern. Andrew felt his heart ache at the question. How could he explain this to Elijah? How could he tell him that the people who had left him were now returning? Matthew stepped forward, his voice trembling slightly. "Elijah, we're your biological parents." The words struck Elijah like a physical blow. His face paled, eyes widening as he stared at the couple. "What?" he whispered, disbelief seeping into his voice. He looked back at Andrew, searching his face for reassurance or some semblance of understanding. But Andrew found himself at a loss for words, unable to provide immediate comfort. "Elijah," Andrew began softly, his voice shaking under the weight of what he needed to say. "We need to talk." Elijah's eyes shifted between Andrew and the couple again, his confusion deepening with each passing second. "Dad, what's happening?" Andrew reached out, placing a hand on Elijah's shoulder in an attempt to steady him, to anchor him in this bewildering moment. "Come inside, son," he said gently. "We'll discuss everything, I promise." Matthew and Sarah stood awkwardly in the doorway, their faces etched with uncertainty. Andrew's initial instinct was to send them away, to shield Elijah from the chaos their return might bring. But he knew they couldn't ignore this. Elijah deserved to know the truth. As daunting as it was, Andrew had to confront it too. Reluctantly, Andrew stepped aside, allowing the couple to enter. Elijah watched them carefully, his body tense, as though bracing himself for something he couldn't yet comprehend. The four of them moved to the living room, the weight of silence pressing down as they took their seats. Matthew cleared his throat, looking directly at Elijah. "Elijah, there's no easy way to say this. We're your biological parents, and we've been searching for you for a long time. We had to give you up when you were just a baby because we didn't have a home. We had nothing." Elijah's expression remained unreadable as he absorbed the information. His fists clenched at his sides, jaw tight. "Why didn't you come back sooner?" His voice was low but edged with a raw hurt that cut through the room. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "We tried, Elijah, we did, but we needed to get back on our feet first. We didn't want to find you until we could offer you something better, a home, stability. We didn't want to take you away from the life you had with Dad. But now that we've found you, we want to be a part of your life." Elijah shook his head, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "But I have a life here. With Dad. You weren't there. He was." Andrew felt a lump form in his throat at Elijah's words. He had been there for every scraped knee, every school play, every bedtime story. And now, Elijah's world was being disrupted by people who had been absent all these years. "Elijah," Andrew said softly, "I know this is a lot to take in. I know you're confused and upset. But they are your biological parents. And I think it's important that we try to understand what this means for all of us." Tears filled Elijah's eyes as he looked at Andrew. "But I don't want them. I want you." His voice cracked, and Andrew's heart shattered at the sound. Andrew reached out, pulling Elijah into a tight embrace. "I'm not going anywhere, buddy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll always be your dad. That doesn't change." Behind him, Matthew and Sarah sat quietly, their faces marked by pain and guilt. They had hoped for a reunion, but it was clear that this wasn't going to be easy. Years of absence couldn't be undone with a few words. After a long pause, Andrew addressed the couple, his voice calm yet firm. "We'll figure this out," he said. "But we'll do it in a way that's best for Elijah. We'll go at his pace." Matthew nodded, his face pale. "Of course," he replied quietly. We want him to know the truth." Andrew looked at Elijah, who was still holding on to him, and nodded. "He will, but it's going to take time." As they sat together in the living room, the enormity of the moment settled over them. Elijah's world had shifted, and Andrew realized that nothing would ever be quite the same again. However, one thing was clear: no matter what happened next, Andrew would always be there for Elijah. That was a promise he intended to keep. The days following the Coopers' unexpected arrival felt like a slow-building storm, filled with tension, uncertainty, and a painful quiet that enveloped Andrew and Elijah's home. The familiar warmth and routine that once provided constant comfort now seemed distant, as if the very foundation of their lives had been altered. For Elijah, discovering his biological parents left him feeling more lost than ever. He had always known that Andrew wasn't his biological father, but the love and stability Andrew provided had made that fact seem almost irrelevant. Now, faced with the reality of Matthew and Sarah Cooper, his blood relatives, Elijah felt torn. There was an internal pull, a mix of curiosity and resentment, an emotional struggle between the life he had always known and this new chapter forcing itself into existence. Andrew felt it too. He watched as Elijah, once confident and lively, grew more distant, wrestling with questions he couldn't answer. The thought of losing Elijah, the son he cherished deeply, was unbearable. Every shared smile, every joke over breakfast, every quiet movie night now felt fragile, as if they could shatter at any moment. Yet, Andrew knew deep down that this was inevitable. He had always anticipated that one day, Elijah would seek to understand his origins. The Coopers' arrival had simply accelerated the process before either of them were prepared. As much as Andrew feared the changes this might bring to his relationship with Elijah, he understood that Elijah needed to explore this part of himself. Despite the terror it brought him, he had to face it for Elijah's sake. Matthew and Sarah Cooper approached the situation with gentleness. They had clearly prepared for this moment, and despite the lingering pain from their past mistakes, they were careful not to overwhelm Elijah. They didn't want to take him away from Andrew. Instead, they sought the opportunity to be a part of his life. Having rebuilt themselves with new jobs, a stable home, and a future they could now offer Elijah, they were painfully aware that they were still strangers to him. After several days of conversations, gentle nudges, and Andrew's encouragement, Elijah reluctantly agreed to spend a week with them in Hoboken. Andrew had suggested it, hoping it would provide Elijah the space to get to know them without feeling overwhelmed. It was a difficult decision, but Andrew recognized that Elijah needed this step if he wanted to feel secure in his choices. Still, the idea of Elijah packing a bag and leaving their apartment, even temporarily, felt like an unready loss for Andrew. The day arrived, and tension filled the air in their apartment. Elijah moved slowly and deliberately as he packed his backpack, carefully folding his clothes as if trying to prolong the inevitable. Andrew watched from the doorway, attempting to mask his anxiety, though the fear gnawed at him relentlessly. "Do you have everything you need?" Andrew asked softly, trying to sound casual. Elijah nodded without looking up. "Yeah." Andrew swallowed hard, wanting to say something to ease the situation, something to remind Elijah that their bond was unbreakable. But the words remained stuck in his throat. When the Coopers arrived, the atmosphere shifted once more. They were kind, patient, and respectful of Andrew's role in Elijah's life, but the weight of the situation was palpable. Elijah gave Andrew a tight hug before stepping out of the apartment, his backpack slung over his shoulder as he hurried toward the familiar building. Andrew stood in the doorway, his heart pounding with anticipation. As soon as Elijah saw him, a smile broke across his face, a smile that conveyed everything Andrew needed to know. "Dad!" Elijah called, running into Andrew's open arms. Andrew embraced him tightly, his relief evident. "Welcome home, buddy." In that moment, as Elijah rested his head against Andrew's shoulder, Andrew realized that no matter the changes ahead, their bond would remain steadfast. Elijah might navigate between two worlds, but he had found his way back to the one that mattered most. It was a quiet evening when Matthew and Sarah Cooper knocked on Andrew's door once again. This time their faces held no signs of anxiety or hesitation. Instead, they wore expressions of resolution and hope, and Andrew sensed that whatever they were about to say would alter everything. Andrew opened the door, his heart racing as he motioned them inside. Elijah was in his room, giving the three adults a moment to converse privately. They stood in the living room, the familiar yet slightly tense atmosphere lingering between them. The Coopers exchanged a glance before Matthew began, his voice steady. "Andrew, we've been thinking a lot about this, about Elijah, about what's best for him. We can see how much he loves you, how much this home means to him," Matthew started, his words measured and heartfelt. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes warm yet determined. "We don't want Elijah to feel like he has to choose between us. He shouldn't have to live in two separate worlds. So we've made a decision," she said softly, pausing briefly. "We're going to move to Manhattan." Andrew blinked, taken aback by the announcement. "You're moving? Here?" "Yes," Matthew affirmed, nodding. "We found a place just a few blocks away. It's smaller than our home in Hoboken, but it's close enough that Elijah can spend time with both of us without feeling torn apart." Andrew stared at them, his mind reeling as he tried to grasp the magnitude of their offer. Moving to Manhattan wasn't just a simple relocation, it was a significant sacrifice, a gesture of immense generosity and understanding. They were giving up their life in Hoboken to ensure Elijah could maintain relationships with both families. It was a selfless act that filled Andrew with profound gratitude. Are you certain about this?" Andrew asked, his voice laden with emotion. Sarah smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We're sure. Elijah's happiness is what matters most to us, and we've seen how much you mean to him. We want to do this for him, and for you." Andrew felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at Elijah, who was still holding on to him tightly. He nodded, understanding the depth of their decision. "Thank you," he whispered quietly, his voice trembling. "I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Matthew replied softly. "We're all in this together." A few weeks later, the Coopers had settled into their new apartment, a cozy, modest space, just a short walk from Andrew's building. The first time Elijah saw it, he was stunned. He hadn't expected them to uproot their lives for him, and the thought of having both families so close brought a strange but comforting sense of relief. He no longer felt divided between two worlds. Instead, they were merging, and for the first time since learning about his biological parents, Elijah felt a deep sense of peace. His new routine took some adjustment. Weekdays were spent with Matthew and Sarah, who helped him with homework, prepared dinner, and gradually integrated themselves into his life. Their new apartment, though smaller than the one in Hoboken, was filled with warmth, and they made every effort to make it feel like a home for Elijah. Framed photos of Elijah from both his time with Andrew and his recent days with them adorned the walls, symbolizing the blending of the two families. Weekends, however, were different. On Friday evenings, Elijah would pack a small bag and walk the short distance to Andrew's apartment, the familiar warmth of his childhood home welcoming him. There, he and Andrew seamlessly fell back into their usual routines, playing basketball at the park, sharing pizza on the couch, and watching old action movies late into the night. The tension that had once hung between them during those uncertain days had lifted, replaced by an unspoken understanding that their bond was unbreakable. Birthdays and holidays became shared celebrations, something Elijah had never thought possible. His 14th birthday was the first major milestone since the Coopers moved to Manhattan, and it was an event that brought both families together, filling the room with laughter, love, and a sense of unity. The Coopers hosted the party at their new apartment, decorating the living room with balloons and a colorful banner that read, "Happy Birthday, Elijah." Andrew arrived early, carrying a homemade chocolate cake, a tradition he had never abandoned. When Elijah saw it, his face lit up with a mix of nostalgia and excitement. "You made the cake, Dad?" Elijah asked, his voice warm. Andrew smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "Of course I did. It wouldn't be your birthday without it." The afternoon brimmed with laughter and joy as both families came together around the table. Sarah had prepared a second cake, a majestic vanilla confection adorned with fresh berries, and when the moment arrived to light the candles, Elijah sat beaming between his two sets of parents, the candlelight casting a warm glow on his face. "Make a wish," Sarah whispered softly, her eyes shining with happiness. Elijah closed his eyes briefly, the room holding its breath in anticipation. When he finally blew out the candles, he glanced around at the faces of those who had become so important to him, Andrew, Matthew, and Sarah. His heart swelled with gratitude for this new life he had embraced, one that allowed him to cherish the best of both worlds. As the months went by, Elijah became more at ease with his new circumstances. Naturally, there were times of adjustment. Balancing the love and attention from two sets of parents, navigating the distinct dynamics of each household, but Elijah handled it gracefully. He found delight in the little moments, realizing his life had become richer and more meaningful. During the weekdays, he delved deeper into the lives of the Coopers, listening to stories about their past, their challenges, and the enduring love they had always held for him, even from afar. They introduced him to extended family members who welcomed him warmly, eager to get to know the boy who had always been in their hearts, even if they hadn't met him before. Weekends remained special. Elijah and Andrew continued their tradition of playing basketball in the park, their competitive spirit undiminished. Occasionally, Matthew joined them, and the three laughed as they passed the ball back and forth, with Elijah always eager to showcase his latest move. It wasn't long before they found a comfortable rhythm, making Elijah feel as though his world was no longer split but harmoniously blended. Holidays also took on new significance. Thanksgiving became a bustling affair in the kitchen, with both families contributing to the feast. Andrew roasted the turkey, Sarah baked the pumpkin pie, and Matthew prepared his renowned mashed potatoes. As they all sat around the table, passing dishes and sharing stories, Elijah realized how truly special his situation was. Not everyone had two families who loved them so deeply, and this thought filled him with a profound sense of belonging. One Sunday afternoon, Elijah sat on Andrew's porch, the golden light of the autumn sun warming his face, reflecting on how much had changed. A year ago, he hadn't even known who his biological parents were. Now they lived just a few blocks away, intricately woven into his life in ways he could never have imagined. And Andrew, his father, the man who had raised him with unwavering love, had remained steadfast through it all, never faltering, never letting go. Elijah smiled to himself as he watched the leaves fall from the trees, the soft rustling of the wind surrounding him in a peaceful embrace. He had found his place, a balance between two families who were no longer separate but united by their love for him. Andrew joined him on the porch, carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate. He handed one to Elijah and sat down beside him, the comfortable silence between them a familiar and reassuring presence. "You know," Elijah began after a moment, gazing out at the street, "I used to think my life was too complicated. But now, I think I'm pretty lucky." Andrew smiled, a warmth filling his chest at his son's words. "You are lucky," he agreed softly. "And so are we." Elijah looked at Andrew, his eyes reflecting the deep understanding they had always shared. "Thanks for everything, Dad, for never giving up on me." Andrew's throat tightened with emotion as he placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "I'll never give up on you, son. Not ever." As they sat together, sipping their hot chocolate, the world around them seemed to settle into place. It wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was theirs, and that was enough. Elijah had discovered his new beginning, where love, family, and belonging stemmed from multiple sources. In that realization, he found peace. The auditorium buzzed with excitement as families filled the seats, searching for the best spots to watch their loved ones receive their diplomas. The scent of fresh flowers mingled with the crisp aroma of polished floors, and the chatter of proud parents created a gentle hum throughout the hall. On stage, the high school's crest shone brightly in the warm light, symbolizing achievement and growth. Backstage, Elijah stood in his cap and gown, his heart racing with a mix of excitement and nerves. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, trying to steady his jittery hands as he held his valedictorian speech. The importance of this day was not lost on him. It wasn't just the end of high school. It was the culmination of years of learning, growing, and navigating a once uncertain world. Now, as he stood on the brink of adulthood, Elijah felt prepared to face whatever came next. But today, more than anything, he wanted to honor those who had shaped him into who he had become. Peeking out from behind the stage curtain, Elijah scanned the audience, searching for the faces that meant the most to him. His eyes quickly found Andrew in the front row, his hands resting on his knees, waiting with a mixture of pride and emotion etched across his face. Just a few seats over sat Matthew and Sarah, their eyes fixed on the stage, their expressions mirroring Andrew's. A quiet awe, as if they couldn't quite believe the boy they had all helped raise was now standing on the threshold of his future. For a moment, Elijah's throat tightened. These three people, so different, yet united in their love for him, were the foundation of his life. He remembered the early years with Andrew, the laughter, the sleepless nights, the basketball games in the park. He recalled the moment he met Matthew and Sarah, how his world had shifted, how he had struggled to make sense of it all. And yet here they were, his two sets of parents, their differences set aside, sitting together in the audience, bound by a shared love for him. Taking a deep breath, Elijah stepped onto the stage as the principal called his name. The auditorium erupted in applause, but for Elijah, the sound was distant, muffled by the pounding of his heart. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone, his eyes scanning the crowd once more until they settled on Andrew, Matthew, and Sarah. He could see the tears in Sarah's eyes, the way Matthew's chest rose and fell with deep breaths as he tried to contain his emotion, and the quiet pride on Andrew's face. For a moment, the enormity of it all washed over Elijah. These were the people who had given him everything, the ones who had shaped him, nurtured him, and loved him unconditionally. This moment wasn't just about him, it was about them too. Clearing his throat, Elijah began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Today is a day of endings and beginnings, a day of celebration, and a day of reflection, he said, his eyes never leaving the faces of his parents. As I stand here, about to embark on the next chapter of my life, I can't help but think about the people who got me here, the people who believed in me, who loved me, who helped me become the person I am today. The audience listened in silence, hanging on every word, but Elijah's world had narrowed to those three faces in the front row. His heart swelled with gratitude as he continued. I've been lucky enough to have not just one family, but two, he said, his voice soft but unwavering. Two sets of parents who have loved me unconditionally, and who have shown me that family isn't defined by blood, but by the love we share. A murmur of emotion rippled through the crowd, but Elijah's focus remained on the people who mattered most. He saw the way Sarah reached for Matthew's hand, how Andrew blinked back tears, his face a mixture of pride and nostalgia. Elijah's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of all they had been through together, all they had overcome. Andrew, Elijah said, turning his gaze to the man who had raised him from the moment he found him in the park. You've been there for me every step of the way. You've taught me what it means to be strong, to be kind, and to never give up. You've been more than just a father. You've been my rock, my guide, and my greatest supporter. Andrew's eyes glistened with tears, and he nodded ever so slightly, his chest tight with emotion. The auditorium seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the connection between Elijah and Andrew, an unbreakable bond that had weathered every storm life had thrown at them. Then Elijah turned his gaze to Matthew and Sarah, who sat side by side, their hands clasped together, their eyes filled with a mixture of joy and sadness. Matthew, Sarah, you came into my life when I didn't even know I needed you. You helped me understand where I came from, and you've been so patient, so loving, and so willing to share in the life I already had. I'm so grateful for you, and for the love you've shown me." Sarah wiped away a tear as Matthew squeezed her hand, his face reflecting the depth of his gratitude for the words Elijah had spoken. For them, this moment was more than just a celebration of Elijah's academic success. It was a recognition of the family they had become, the family they had fought so hard to build. Elijah took a deep breath, his heart full. "What I've learned, what I hope to carry with me for the rest of my life, is that family is not about biology. It's about choice. It's about the people who choose to love you, to stand by you, to be there for you no matter what. And I'm so lucky to have not just one, but two families who have chosen me." The audience erupted in applause, but Elijah barely heard it. His eyes remained on his parents, both sets of them, and the love that radiated from their faces was all the validation he needed. In that moment, he realized that the journey he had taken, the one that had once felt so uncertain and divided, had led him to this: two families united in their love for him, standing together as one. As Elijah stepped back from the microphone, the applause grew louder, echoing through the auditorium like a wave of shared emotion. His classmates cheered, his teachers smiled, but all Elijah could see were the tears in his parents' eyes, both sets of them. After the ceremony, the families gathered outside the auditorium, the air filled with the joyful sounds of celebration. Andrew, Matthew, and Sarah stood together, their differences long forgotten, replaced by a mutual respect and understanding that had grown over the years. Elijah found himself at the center of it all, enveloped in hugs and words of congratulations from the people who had shaped his life. Andrew pulled Elijah into a tight embrace, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, son. You've worked so hard for this." Elijah smiled, leaning into the hug. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad." Matthew stepped forward next, placing a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You've become an incredible young man, Elijah. We're so lucky to be part of your life." Sarah wiped away the last of her tears and smiled at Elijah, her voice soft with pride. "You've brought us all together, Elijah. You've shown us the true meaning of family." Elijah looked around at the people who stood with him, Andrew, Matthew, Sarah, and for the first time he felt a deep sense of completeness. They weren't just two separate families anymore. They were one, united by the love they had for him, by the choice they'd all made to be a part of each other's lives. As they walked together through the school grounds, the sun setting in the distance, Elijah knew that this was only the beginning. His journey wasn't just about where he had come from, it was about where he was going. And with these three people by his side, he knew he could face anything. Together, they stood on the cusp of a new chapter, their hearts full of love, their future filled with promise. As the years passed, the bonds between Andrew, Matthew, Sarah, and Elijah only deepened, solidifying into something unshakable and beautiful. What had begun as two separate worlds, Andrew's years as a single father and the Cooper's re-entry into Elijah's life, had now merged into a single cohesive family unit. It was unconventional, yes, but it was theirs, and it worked because it was built on a foundation of love, understanding, and the shared desire to give Elijah the best life possible. Holidays, once a source of uncertainty and negotiation, quickly became cherished celebrations filled with laughter and warmth. Thanksgiving dinners were now grand feasts, where Andrew's infamous turkey was complemented by Sarah's homemade pies, and Matthew's mashed potatoes were always a hit. Elijah would sit at the head of the table, watching his two sets of parents exchange stories, laughter, and memories like old friends. The house echoed with the sounds of clinking glasses, the rustling of wrapping paper, and the kind of joy that could only come from a family that had found peace in their shared love. But beyond the holidays, it was the small, everyday moments that truly brought the families closer together. Weekends were spent lounging in Central Park, picnicking under the very trees where Andrew had first found Elijah all those years ago. The park had become a symbol of their journey, a place where, once upon a time, loneliness had reigned, but had since transformed into a sanctuary of connection, love, and new beginnings. On warm Saturday afternoons, Elijah often found himself sitting on a bench, watching Andrew and Matthew engage in friendly competition, tossing a frisbee back and forth while Sarah spread out a picnic blanket nearby. The once solemn park now carried the echoes of their laughter, a reminder of how far they had come. "I still remember the first time I saw you," Andrew said one afternoon as they strolled along the familiar park path, his voice soft with nostalgia. "You were so small, so helpless, lying there in that bundle of blankets. I had no idea how much my life would change in that moment." Elijah smiled, feeling the weight of those words. "And look at us now," he replied, his voice filled with gratitude. "We're all here, together." For Elijah, the park wasn't just the place where his life had begun with Andrew. It had become a symbol of transformation. It was here that his family had grown, here that he had learned what it meant to be loved unconditionally by not just one parent, but by four. The park had once been a place of loneliness and abandonment, but now it stood as a testament to the power of love, to the way people could come together and create something beautiful out of the most unexpected circumstances. As Elijah moved into adulthood, the dynamic of the family continued to evolve. His relationship with each of his parents deepened as he began to make his way in the world. Andrew, Matthew, and Sarah supported him in every decision, offering guidance when needed, but also stepping back when they sensed that Elijah needed to forge his own path. By the time Elijah graduated from college, the once blurry lines between his two families had all but disappeared. Andrew and Matthew, once cautious around each other, now joked like old friends, sharing stories about Elijah's childhood and how proud they were of the man he had become. Sarah, always the nurturing figure, made sure to check in on Elijah no matter where he was, sending him care packages and handwritten letters that reminded him of how loved he was. Elijah often found himself reflecting on how lucky he was to have not just one home, but two dads, two moms, and four people who cared deeply about him. And though it had taken time for the families to merge seamlessly, they had done it with grace, with patience, and with an unwavering commitment to Elijah's happiness. One summer, the entire family decided to take a vacation together, a trip that would mark a new chapter in their ever-growing bond. They rented a cabin near a lake in the Adirondacks, a secluded and peaceful place where they could all unwind and spend time together. The drive up was filled with laughter and teasing, with Andrew navigating the winding roads while Matthew attempted to read the map, much to everyone's amusement. When they arrived, the sight of the shimmering lake greeted them, its glassy surface reflecting the towering trees that surrounded it. Elijah stood on the shore, looking out at the water, feeling a deep sense of contentment. This was what his life had become, a series of shared moments of love that spanned across two families but felt like one. Days at the cabin were filled with simple pleasures. They took long hikes through the woods, with Matthew and Andrew competing to see who could spot the most wildlife, while Sarah and Elijah lagged behind, laughing at their playful banter. Evenings were spent around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories, the crackling of the fire filling the quiet night. Elijah often caught himself smiling at the sight of his two dads, Andrew and Matthew, sitting side by side, sharing a bottle of wine like they had been friends for years. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the lake, Sarah leaned over to Elijah, her voice soft. "You've brought us all together, Elijah. I hope you know that." Elijah looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I know," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "and I wouldn't trade it for anything." The years continued to pass, and with each milestone, the family only grew closer. Elijah's successes were celebrated by both families as one, his challenges met with the unwavering support of the people who loved him most. And no matter where life took him, Elijah always knew that he had four people in his corner, two dads, two moms who would be there for him no matter what. The park where Andrew had first found Elijah remained a sacred place for all of them. Every year on the anniversary of that fateful day, the entire family would gather there, bringing picnic baskets filled with their favorite foods. It was a quiet tradition, but one that meant the world to all of them. They would sit beneath the very tree where Elijah had once been abandoned. The air filled with the sound of bird song and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. "Can you believe it's been all these years?" Sarah would often say, looking at the park with a sense of awe. Andrew would nod, his eyes distant but filled with warmth. "It feels like yesterday," he'd reply, his voice carrying the weight of all the memories that had followed that moment. And Elijah would sit between them, feeling the love that had grown out of that one act of kindness, that single decision that had changed everything. As Elijah entered adulthood, he carried with him the lessons his two families had taught him, that love wasn't defined by blood, but by choice. That family was something you built, something you nurtured, and something that could come from the most unexpected places. He knew that he was the luckiest person in the world to have two dads and two moms, each of them bringing something different but equally important to his life. And as he looked toward the future, Elijah knew one thing for certain: no matter where life took him, he would always be surrounded by love, support, and the unwavering belief that family in all its forms was the most powerful force of all. On a warm summer evening, the two families gathered once again in Central Park for a picnic. As they sat together, laughing and sharing stories, Elijah looked around at the people he loved most. He knew his story wasn't typical, but that's what made it special. As the sun set over New York, casting a golden light over their gathering, Elijah realized something profound. Family wasn't about where you came from, but the love you chose to give, and in that love he had found everything. Andrew, Matthew, and Sarah had all come together, united by their love for him, proving that family is about far more than blood. It's about choice, sacrifice, and unconditional love. But what would you have done in Andrew's shoes? How do you think you would have handled the arrival of Elijah's biological parents? Would you have been able to share your child with another family? And what about Elijah, torn between two worlds, yet finding strength in both? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this emotional journey. And if you like this story, please like, share, and subscribe. We'll see you in the next video.